assistant professor of biology here at Johns Hopkins. I did my graduate work in biophysics at Harvard, and I did my postdoctoral work in behavioral neuroscience at Rockefeller University. And my current research continues at behavioral neuroscience work with a small nematode called C. elegans, which you can see behind me, and spiders.
Okay, and Christy?
Sure. So my name is Christie Thornton. I teach here in the sociology department and help run the program in Latin American studies. I got my PhD in 2015 from NYU in history. And my first job was as an assistant professor of history and international studies at Rowan University, which is a big public university in South Jersey. And then I spent a year as a fellow at Harvard before I came here to Hopkins to start teaching.
And my name is Jude Phillip. So I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins in chemical engineering. I finished there in 2015. And then presently I'm a postdoctoral associate at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York, where I'm an incoming professor at Hopkins in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. So I start in September, in the fall, in a few months. And my work mainly focuses on aging. So during my graduate work, I started developing these cell-based biomarkers of aging. And for my future lab, I'm going to be continuing some of these same types of work, developing these biomarkers, but also incorporating some lymphoma research and how aging actually influences lymphoma and progression and so forth.
Okay, thank you. And so, we've already had the academic job set series where we've had speakers talk about an overview. We then had an academic cover letters and CVs. After that, we had how to write an effective research statement for STEM folk. So today is all about interviews. So let's get straight to that question. Can you each take us back to that moment when you received the invitation to interview with JHU? How did you feel at that moment? And let's start with you, Christy.
Well, if you notice from my bio, my appointment here at Hopkins is in a discipline in which I did not receive a PhD. So my overall feeling was shock and surprise. My interview process here was a little bit strange. Because Hopkins is relatively small, especially over here at Homewood, the departments frequently are allowed to make hires at kind of strange times. We might get permission to put out a line at a kind of strange time during what might otherwise be the kind of normal yearly cycle. So my interview was actually very late. I taught my very last class at Rowan. I gave my last lecture. I applauded my students, and I got in the car to drive from Glassboro to Baltimore to spend the night in the hotel and then spend the entire day doing the interview the next day. So that was the experience was very surprising to me, and maybe a little bit unusual in how it was structured.
Jude, you've just done this, very fresh on your mind. Can you share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, so I started. So the search pattern in engineering it's sort of like a 9-month process, right? So it starts in September the year before, and I remember. So at Hopkins, it was slightly different because Hopkins Biomedical Engineering didn't have an official job search, but I was on the market and expressed some interest within the department because it was one of the places I was really excited about. And they actually invited me in for a seminar. And then a week before I started getting emails, it converted into an interview. Then it went from a 1-day interview to a 3-day interview because so many people wanted to meet with me. And then it happened. But I was super excited about it. And it happened towards the middle of my interview season. So I started back in January and I interviewed at Hopkins in February. And my last interview was in March.
Okay. Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, I had a pretty sort of, I guess, a standard experience. Yeah, I started the application process in, I think, August of 2015. I had my first interview in September. Basically, I had interviews from September through March. Johns Hopkins was my last interview in March. So I was pretty ecstatic to receive email to to interview here. And yeah, I was very relieved after that interview because it was my last interview. So it's a very whirlwind process of meeting lots of departments, meeting people, and yeah, I had a very good experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Each of
Well,
you said
it's
excited.
experience here. Yeah. Yeah.
Each of you said you were very excited, but how about paralyzed with fear? That it'll be helpful to know from a student perspective that it's okay to be scared. Anybody express feel fear?
Yeah, I am. It's very like nerve-wracking going through the process. But the thing that I constantly tell myself in my head is that nervousness keeps me aware of the magnitude of the situation. So right before like essentially game time, I'll be very nervous. But then once things start, then it just calms and then it just kind of rolls.
Yeah. Okay. We are gonna go. Sorry, Christy, did you want to say something?
No, it's fine.
Okay, we are going to go into more detail about that entire interview process, but in general, and I think we could benefit from hearing from each of you your experience. What was the structure of your interview? How many rounds? I know Andrew said it was more traditional, but what was your experience, Christy, with how many rounds, the length, who you were meeting? Did you get like an agenda previously, like you're going to be meeting with these members?
Yeah, so I've interviewed at a number of places, and obviously I've had 2 tenure track academic jobs at this point. So I, have the opportunity to sort of share experiences at 2 very different kinds of institutions. Rowan is a kind of big regional teaching university, and Hopkins obviously is an R1 research university. And I've interviewed at small liberal arts colleges and other kinds of places. So I will say that I found that in general, there is a kind of traditional format for the kind of preliminary interview, and then the campus visit can be very idiosyncratic depending on what the institution is. I will say the 2 big differences between my campus visits was at Rowan, which is a regional teaching college. I was required to give a teaching demonstration. I actually had to do in classroom work, whereas here at Hopkins, I was required just to give a job talk and meet with people. But in both cases, I was given a long portfolio. I mean, maybe this was the case for Jude as well. He mentioned all the people who wanted to meet with him, a long schedule, kind of relentless schedule of meeting with people, from first thing in the morning, somebody picks you up at breakfast and sort of takes you through campus all day, and you meet with deans and you meet with faculty and you meet with students, and yeah, very structured day and a half, I guess for Jude, in Jude's case, up to 3 days, right? So yeah, it was a very, very highly structured process once you get to the campus visit.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Jude.
Yeah, so the structure of mine, so there were differences already from like there's either like a Zoom or a phone call. And in some cases, I didn't have either of those because I did meet the faculty candidates at some conferences. So what I didn't realize was that I was being essentially interviewed when
right.
around. And I think it was good actually that I maybe didn't know because I was more at ease. But so in some cases, so the structure was typically that you would have this Zoom interview and then have like if you make it past that round, you get invited on campus. And then it varied. So some places I went, it was like a 1 day, 100 miles per hour kind of experience. So I flew in sometimes like the night before, and then the evening of the interview leave. And then the longest one I had was actually 3 days. So I was in the place for 4 days. So I came in the night before, had meetings every day. So essentially you start at 7:30, 8 o'clock for breakfast, and you're on until, in cases with the dinner, it goes maybe until 9:30, 10. And then, yeah, kind of sequence through that. But it's fun. You just have to, keep keeping it fun, and yeah.
So it sounds like you have to build up a lot of stamina beforehand to prepare for this mentally. Talking about preparation, let me ask you before we go into the breakout rooms, are you the sort of folks who prepare in advance or wing it on the day off? Should you prepare for academic interviews, and how much in advance should one prepare? And let's start with Andrew.
You should prepare a lot. I mean, when I wrote my job proposal that I submitted for my applications, it's not on this computer, but I think I wrote about 20 to 30 drafts, and I sent them to lots of people to read and to get feedback from. And I sent them to people outside my field to make sure it was understandable, for people. Then the talk I gave, I I'd given previous talks before, but I gave practice talks to some faculty who gave me feedback to tailor the talk more for a job interview rather than just a regular conference. And then for the chalk talk, my first chalk talk actually did kind of wing, and that was a disaster. So I don't recommend doing that because I really didn't know what I was doing. I had never witnessed a chalk talk before. But fortunately, a good friend of mine kind of sat me down and explained it to me. And then I practiced that with a group of postdocs. There was an organization at Rockefeller of postdocs who got together to practice chalk talks. And after practicing that, it was a lot better. It's a very kind of unique thing that you're not trained for normally because it's kind of a unique experience. It's more similar to like a thesis defense. That should be practiced a lot because it's easy for that to fall apart. And it's really, during the interview process, it's a really an opportunity for the faculty in the department to really assess your mastery of what you're trying to propose. And if you fall apart in that, it's over.
Christy, you've had the experience of interviewing multiple places. Now that you know how to interview, do you still prepare for interviews?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I've actually also had the experience of I've been on a job search here at Hopkins. So I've now been the interviewer in addition to being the interviewee. So being on a search committee here at Hopkins was very illuminating to kind of think about what it was like when I was sitting on the other side of the table and now being on that side. So I definitely prepare. And in addition to preparing for the talk and doing practice talks and making sure that you're getting disciplinary and interdisciplinary feedback, which I think are points that Andrew raised that are really important. One of the most important things that I did to prepare once I got to the campus visit stage, and even for the preliminary interview, whether that happened at a conference or via Skype, was kind of knowing who people were and, you know, what their research was about, what their role was within the department, sort of what their specialties were, you know, places that I might have something to sort of hook in with them. And so I kept a notebook. Actually, I didn't want to have like a bunch of papers, so I kept a notebook and I wrote down by hand the name of every faculty member I was meeting with, what their specialty was, you know, something about their research. And so something about, you know, we say this to our students all the time, but committing those notes to hand and writing that down in a notebook, and then having that notebook as the place that I was actually taking notes while I was doing the interview meant that I could kind of refer back to it as I was looking. So when I was talking to somebody or somebody was coming, I could kind of quickly go and say, oh, the next person I'm meeting with is this person and they work on this kind of thing. And so having that as a kind of material for preparing for the people that I would be meeting with was super important.
Okay, so let's
I
learn from
totally agree
Jude.
with Christy. I totally agree with Christy. That's critically important. I did that as well. It's faculty love it when you express interest in their work, and so walking in and having the questions set are really important.
And you can actually tell when someone is prepared or not. I remember in a few cases where I walked into the room and the person interviewing me wasn't as prepared, and I know the feeling that I got. So and that I was preparing from before, but that even gave me like a stronger like motivation to prepare, because I don't like that feeling of like, you know, you walk in and you're going in cold, right? So what I did was I would write, as Christy and Andrew said, I would write it down, and then I would take a picture of it on my phone. And then every time, because every person you go to meet, they'll ask you if you want to go to the bathroom, right? Because usually they use that to help you to straighten your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And even if you don't need to, you go. And I would like check my phone, see who I'm meeting with next, and then kind of like make a mental note. And I would always, so I have like a really great set of mentors that has really like mentored me through the process. And we talk frequently. So with whatever department I would go into, I would always like send them an email or a text and say, oh, do you know anybody in that department? And then they would say, oh, I know this person, this person, this person. And then typically they'll say, oh, tell this person I said hi. And just by the fact of you going in the room and saying, oh, you know, Professor this said hi, it just breaks down their defense. And even if they had some, you know, not so good thoughts to you initially, like it just kind of like gets things to flow. And I think like finding common points of reference with anybody you talk to is important. And another thing that some people don't do is that, you know, the people who like take you around and the persons who like set up like your schedule and so forth, you need to be like super appreciative of them, because it's a lot of work getting into that, but also that's also, you know, they're getting a feel for how you fit by that, right? How you treat people, and like, and you don't have, it's not the faking it, right? But just being like a well-mannered, like good person. Yeah.
That's fantastic, fantastic advice. Let's go and delve deeper into your individual processes by entering into the breakout rooms. So all of you will get an invitation to enter. So just click yes. And I'm going to open up the rooms now, and we'll meet you on the other side of this. Hi.
Already allowed to ask questions?
Yeah, of course.
I have a question. Was there like you said you had several interviews. Was there like one question that you got asked that was like repeated in all the interviews at different places? Like I'm guessing there's obvious things like, is your research scalable or things like that, but something, I don't know, anything that you can think of that you felt was, you were maybe not as prepared or had to think about, but that kept repeating itself?
So actually, yeah, I think a common question, and I've also been on 2 faculty search committees, and this question is also asked at the search committees I'm on. But during the chalk talk, they want to see what your vision is for the first 5 years, and then your vision for the next 10 to 20 years. And they want to see that you are able to think on the short time scale, like where are the projects you want to do immediately, and then how are these projects setting the foundation for your lab in the future. And they also want to see how practical these projects are, because sometimes, you know, and I've suffered from this too. You have sort of these grand visions of what you want to do, but you have to remember that you're often going to start off with people who are not trained already for your lab, and so you have to have projects that are you know, scalable and doable for graduate students. We interviewed someone a couple of years ago who struggled to answer this question. He was proposing these like really outlandish experiments that would be possible if he had like an army of postdocs at a large institute. And we kept pressing him like, well, how could you make this project accessible to a graduate student? And he couldn't answer the question. They want to see your vision for the short time scale and the long time scale.
Yeah, that's something. It's not a question I also got a lot too, in terms of, so the way my approach to structuring, for instance, my chalk talk was, because I was going into, and like biomedical, I interviewed both at biomedical engineering departments and chemical engineering departments, right? And my degree is in chemical engineering, but my work is more bioengineering. And so I kept it more at a higher level, and I started off like broad and then like zoomed in, but constantly going back and forth, because you don't want to just like keep it high or keep it very low, but you have to keep going back across the scales. And I think one of the most, I guess, not outlandish, but a question that I was asked that I had never really thought about, which was, what is the first paper that your lab is going to publish? Which I thought was, so you tell your whole plan, you'd say like, this is what you're going to do. These are like potential outcomes of it. This is kind of like the timeline, your grad students, postdocs, whatever you're doing. But in that, and I was only asked that question in one place. And I felt like I kind of struggled through the answer, because I was wrestling with my mind. Like, that is not a question I thought about, right? Yeah, so that was one of the ones that really stood out. What's your first paper going to be? Yeah, and it changes, right? And at that point, they just want to get how you're thinking. They want to see like, okay, can you like kind of compartmentalize all that ideas and information that you just gave into a packaged something that is digestible. And the person who asked me that was in a field completely different from mine. So he was just trying to gauge sort of like if it's feasible.
I think an even more explicit version of that question is, what will your first grant be? they want to see like you have a vision set up for applying for that first grant and getting it. And then for the long time scale questions, they want to see after you get this first grant, how are you going to keep maintaining that? Because in the end, they want you to be able to fund your own lab. And if you don't have a vision for doing that, then they're not going to hire you. They want to see someone who's going to be successful at research, and being successful at research really means being successful at landing those grants.
We have a question. Go ahead, Rachel, and then we'll ask a question from Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because it's kind of a follow-up to this one. Like, how much do you feel like your committee, the search committee, kind of focused on things you had done in the past versus things that you're planning to do in the future? I guess, like, because it sounds like from the things that you mentioned so far that most of it's just making sure that the future plans that you have are pretty airtight. Like, I guess, like, how much do you feel like your committee was expecting you to hold to stuff that you have already shown expertise in, things that you've published in, versus things that you're trying to do in the future?
So I think it's a balance, right? But so the things that you've already done, the fact that you made it to the on-site means like you're already like above like their threshold that they have, which changes for different places. But they want to see that your future plans are doable based on the expertise that you have, right? So typically you can't just come in and propose something completely new that you've never done before, but you think is super interesting. But it has to be sort of like a progressive step. So, so for instance, in my case, right? So I started doing aging research in my PhD, right? And I drove like this whole project during my PhD. And then in my postdoc, I went into a completely different field, into lymphoma, working with physicians, right? But my plan overall was that for my faculty position, I'm gonna combine those two, right? So by combining them, I now have a way to distinguish myself from my PhD advisor and a way to distinguish myself from my postdoc advisor, but also form my own sort of like career path that is distinct, right? So it has multiple, it serves multiple purposes, but I think just it's a balance of both. So it's both what you've done, what you're doing now, and what you propose to do in the short term and long term.
I agree. If you've made it to the interview, they are ecstatic about what you've done, and they want to use the interview to see what you will do in the future and make sure that your plans for the future are practical given your experience. For example, when I applied for jobs, all my proposed research was focused on, building upon prior work I did with my worm research. But then in the job proposal, I said I will continue that, and also have this other idea of doing work with spiders I'm interested in, which I have no experience with. And they said, that's great, so long as you continue the worm work. Like if I had just proposed the spider research, there's no way they would have hired me, because they would have thought I was nuts. So you really have to sort of, and as was mentioned, they want to see you try to distinguish yourself from your previous advisor, because they don't want you to be competing with this, this other person. And oftentimes the committees have a fairly good sense of how competitive your mentors are. Like if you come from a lab where your mentor was super competitive, they'll ask more questions in that regard. Like, how are you going to sort of separate yourself from this person? Because they want to make sure you're not trying to directly compete with your mentors, because that's never a good idea.
Andrew, we have a question from Stephen, who's wondering if anyone has if you have experience applying for a position in which folks are bringing their own funding in. He says that he knows that in the JHU School of Medicine, for example, it's structured this way, and wondering how the process differs from school to school, department to department. And a part two, Jude, you can answer is, how do you demonstrate your value as a potential faculty member without a strong track record of funding? So Andrew, if you can answer the first question about bringing in funding and how that differs from place to place, if you have any idea about it.
That's normally kind of tangential, I guess. I mean, it's good to show that you've been successful at applying for funding. Whether or not you come with money or not, at least with regard to the biology department, it doesn't seem to be as important, especially since they know that not all postdocs have had the opportunity to apply for independent grants with their advisor and staff. They focus more on your publication record, and less so on the bringing the funding in. Because if we're doing the job interview, the dean has assured us that we have a certain amount of money that we can spend. So we're not looking to bring in more money necessarily.
Okay. And Jude, what if you don't have a track record?
Yeah, so I didn't come in with a K-99. I know a lot of people think of it in the sense of like coming in with a K-99 and like that is very appealing. I know from experience in talking to people and having friends who've gone through with a K-99, it definitely does help, but it doesn't, if you don't have it, it doesn't hurt you, right? So for instance, I am a co-PI on a big UO1 grant that I wrote together with Denny at Hopkins. So this was all work leading from coming from my PhD. So I had that pot of like money coming in with it, but I didn't use it sort of like, oh, I'm bringing in all this money, right? Because when they're coming in, they're going to give you an offer anyway. And in some departments, it depends. Like, if you're bringing in money, then it makes it a little bit easier to bring you in, given how much you'll need to start up your lab. But it's good. It's really nice if you have it. If you don't, then it doesn't really hurt you. Okay.
And what about teaching experience? How much teaching experience were you expected to have for the positions that you interviewed for?
So teaching experience is always good. So they always ask about it. They even ask you in some cases for teaching evaluations. I didn't have any teaching evaluations. I had teaching experience. So I taught a lot. Even from undergrad, I used to teach like recitation classes, teach like high school. So I was always involved in these programs where as an undergraduate student, you would go into high schools and teach like science, chemistry, and so forth. And I kept that all the way through. So that was the extent of my teaching experience with having to do TA during graduate school. But that was sufficient because you could just demonstrate that, if you have a passion for teaching, it sort of like comes out. But having no teaching experience at all I don't think it hurts you too much if you compensate in other ways, right? But definitely if teaching is something you're passionate about, you should definitely try to get some teaching experience before you get on the market. Yeah.
I think for all the positions I interviewed for, they were all research universities. And they all asked about teaching because I think every position I interviewed for was at a college that was part of a university. But I don't think it was critical to their decision. And on the search committees I was on, we asked questions about the teaching because faculty in the biology department are expected to teach. And in that regard, we did take into account, so faculty candidates who interview in the biology department, they meet with the graduate students. And in the meeting, the faculty ask each other, did any of your students really not like this person? Was this person personable with the students? Because we want to make sure this is someone who will engage well with students. And if they don't engage well, we're hesitant to hire them because it'll cause future headaches in the future. So,
yeah.
However, if you do apply, so I also applied to small colleges. I didn't receive any interviews for them, but I have friends who've done it. And at those schools, they definitely care about teaching experience. And they often have you teach a class so they can witness your teaching style. And so for those types of positions, you should definitely practice a lot. They'll give you some prompt to say, we're going to have you teach this class on genetics and linkage mapping or something. You should practice that lecture a lot. A friend of mine did that. She practiced a lot for her lecture, and she ended up landing the position at was Harvey Mudd. Yeah.
So I agree with everything Andrew said. Also, one thing too is you're also evaluated on your teaching during your job talk and the chalk talk. So every time you're presenting data or work, they're evaluating both your research ability, but also your ability to communicate and speak. And that's something that in the exit interviews with the chairs, like at the end of the interview, they usually meet with the chair of the department, and that's sometimes they give you feedback on that. Like they'll tell you, oh, I really like the way I could really tell that you're a great teacher, or like you can read, you're really well at communicating and so forth. So you're being evaluated on all these different aspects at the same time.
Jude, I think Nikhil has a question, but before Nikhil asks a question, because you said what you said, we have a question from the audience in a private chat. Can you actually talk about the difference between a job talk and a chalk talk real quick?
Yeah, so the job talk is it's pretty much your seminar. You're coming in, this is the work from your PhD or your postdoc. You have your slides ready and you just present. And then the chalk talk is sometimes either right after the job talk or the day after, which is a closed session to only faculty members within the department, or they sometimes invite people from other departments. And that is where they test your ability to critically think, and is where you present your future plan. So you sort of like demonstrate how you go from your present experience all the way to what you're proposing. And then it's interactive, right? So they're constantly asking questions, and if they'll challenge you on certain things, and sometimes they're challenging you to shake you a little bit to see how you respond, right? So they're evaluating many different things. They're evaluating your ability to communicate, how well you understand, how you interact with people, and how your thought process is the main thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Jude said. Your job talk really is a seminar that you've hopefully given many times in the past. I guess the only slight difference is that in the last 10 minutes or so, you try to structure your seminar to sort of like build up to this inevitable future plan. So now I've just done all this work. Now the future for this is this awesome proposal I'm about to pitch to you. And it's just kind of a last 10, 15 minutes kind of grand vision of what you plan to do. And then the chalk talk, the faculty really dig into the details. And my first chalk talk, I just thought it would be this kind of like dynamic back and forth. And really what it should be is you should put up an outline of your future. Like, let's say you have 3 things you want to do in the future. Have the outline up there, have the points written down, so that when the talk starts, the faculty can see what you want to communicate to them during this 1-hour session.
Yeah.
Because the whole talk can get derailed really fast with the questions. And you might end up going down this long sort of tangent, totally sort of kind of irrelevant path with regard to what you want to communicate.
Yeah.
And if all the time gets eaten up with those side questions, you can't communicate your vision. So if you have the outline up on the board, everyone knows what you're trying to get to, and you can it's good to try to practice answering these questions as a lead in to what you want to talk about next. Like, that's a great question, answer it. That actually raises the next point I wanted to say, and then start going. And as Jude said, some people really try to hammer you hard because they want to see how deeply you've thought about it and about the potential pitfalls of what you're proposing. Because when you write a grant, your grant reviewers are going to do that, and you prefer to have that from a friendly audience of your peers. And sometimes they hammer you hard not because they dislike you, just because they want to see how well you'll do. Like when I interviewed here, one of the faculty hammered me really hard, and I thought he hated it. And at the end, he shook my hand. And he said, "Oh, I really enjoyed that. That was really great." I realized like he did like it. He was just challenging me to ensure that I really sort of understood the contours of my project. Because that's not always the case. You get people with awesome CVs who give awesome job talks, and then the chalk talk, you quickly realize they haven't thought things through, and then it falls apart.
And also, last thing, it's important to remember not to become defensive, right? Yes. When you get defensive, your clarity of thought goes away, right? So I remember in the cases where I was pushed like very hard, right? And getting you to start thinking a lot more about it. And then after you would meet with them in their one-on-one meeting, and as Andrew said, they'll say like, "Oh, like that was great, that they really enjoyed it," and so forth.
Nikhil, go ahead.
Right, so thank you guys for doing this. And actually my question was almost covered like right now by you guys, but I have like an offshoot question. So inevitably, when you're giving a chalk talk, you're going to have someone who sort of pushes back, who sort of tries to attack your point of view, sort of create some sort of a stressful environment. So Jude and Andrew, like, what would your strategy be? I think you just covered it, but there's two ways of trying to go about combating this. You could either stand your ground or sort of say, yes, that's a good idea, I haven't thought about it. Like, how do you bunt or swing for the fences, sort of like when do you choose to make that switch?
So
oh, go ahead.
you go ahead, Andrew.
Oh no, you go first.
So pretty much the way is, remember not to be defensive, right? Because when you get on the defensive, then you start thinking, you can't think straight, right? So my strategy, if I'm asked a question that I haven't really like thought through, like, you go through your thought process. You can even go through your thought process out loud at some point, right? So I remember at one case I interviewed, and this was my interview at Stanford, right? So I was challenged based on how I defined aging, right? So I went in saying that, I define aging as this accumulation of like dysfunction and damage that, limits the system later, right? So I thought of it in a very engineering way. And one of the professors there told me, aging is not an accumulation of damage, right? And it was on me. I had to either convince him that how I was thinking was the correct way, or yield to what he was saying and disqualify everything I said or everything I would say, right? Because I had evidence that the way I was thinking about it was correct, and I had actual like data proof, right? But if I get on the defensive, I lose track of where I am, right? So you have to know, like, the way you're proposing things, you have to make sure it's correct, one. And then secondly, you can also convince them that what you're saying is right, but you have to guide them through the process, because many times it's not their field and they're coming at it from an outside view, not knowing all the details. So it's really on you to just fill in the details, give them a track to come towards what your thought process is.
We have a lot of questions in the chat box, guys. So I'm going to start making the answers and questions shorter as well. A lot of questions, and I really want to get to those questions because we have 10 minutes in these rooms. So let me ask you, one of you could answer a very important identity question. So this question's come from Suhas, and he's posted it in the chat for everyone. It says, I'm a member, I identify my member as the LGBTQ community. From the faculty search committee point of view, how is that sort of received? Is that something I should mention in my applications and my diversity statement, or talk with my department chair? Given that I might stay there for a long time, I want to make sure I'm straightforward about this issue with potential future colleagues. Have you heard of examples where this has not been received positively? Of course, it has to be, we have to focus on the work, but it helps to have some insight into how this is perceived from the faculty search point of view. So Andrew.
So a lot of universities do have a diversity statement, and you should definitely, if you feel comfortable discussing this, then you should definitely be open with the committee about who you are and how you self-identify, especially in the diversity statement. It can be the diversity statement isn't necessarily about your own diversity, but how you will deal with that in your work environment and support it and support others who are different than you. So you can really sort of leverage that and say, as a self-identified member of the LGBTQ community, I will really work to try to support students and other members in the department. Then what is application diversity statement? The number one priority for a lot of departments is the quality of your work in the first place. But many departments are trying to diversify their departments with regard to gender and race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And so, so I think you should just always be sort of open with regard to who you are. I have not heard of this ever being negative. I mean, if it is negative, I would seriously question about seeking a position in this place at this place in the first place. So if you do interview somewhere and they react negatively to that, I wouldn't go there, because that's a sign that that is not going to be a very supportive environment for you. You really want to go somewhere that's going to be supportive, because it's so hard. It requires so much work to be a junior faculty and build up your lab and your research, and you want to do it somewhere that's supportive. And if they're not supportive with who you are personally, then it'll be difficult to succeed.
Also, it's based on like how much, like how comfortable you are in disclosing certain things. I think putting it, as Andrew said, in the diversity statement, like building off of it, because it's building off of your own experience, right? And your experience kind of like projects how, like how you approach certain things, right? But I think by law, they're not allowed to like ask like personnel details. So they will know as much as you're willing to share, right? And in some cases, I've had advice from some people saying, oh, like, don't say anything about your personal life. Just keep it close to the vest, right? And I didn't abide by that. I was just open. And I think it was better received, because they, like they genuinely see that, like, you're sharing stuff with them and they understand you a little bit better. So I think it all goes back to based on how comfortable you are in terms of what you want to share. Yeah. You can put,
Jude and Andrew, here's another question from Celia. Thanks for being here today. Since many of us in the STEM require specialized equipment or facilities, that's research animals or patients, to what extent should we prepare for how to make that work at a particular institution? For example, if I'm working with patients, should I try to establish potential collaborations with nearby hospitals in advance of the interview?
I don't think so. It's good, like when you apply for places, you kind of like you look at places that would potentially fit like what you want. So if you need hospital samples and so forth. In my case, I do both animal work and patient work, but I interviewed at places that didn't necessarily have a strong hospital. But if you have collaborators that you can get samples from elsewhere, then it's fine. I don't think it's necessary to add the institution you're going to interview to really reach out and get collaborators, like get the collaborators like on board already. But you should know who are at what institutions, because for instance, in the interview, it comes up, like they ask you, also who other people within the, Hopkins community or so would you be excited to work with, or like, collaborate with, and things like that. And I know in one case, because some of my work was so, had so much like patient and animal involvement, I interviewed at this department who had very, very strong engineering department that I really like, but they were constantly asking me, we don't have a med school, so how are you going to navigate that, right? So how are you going to get these samples? Did you think about it? What is your plan? And so forth. So going in, I think you just need to be prepared, have a plan, but also, you don't necessarily need to reach out and have people lined up.
Okay, and Vishal is asking, what are the challenges in your interview if you have to switch up your field? Say you're applying for a different department from what your major study was. For example, he's a chemistry student wanting to apply to an engineering department. How do you portray that right fit within an interview?
A lot of departments are very interdisciplinary to begin with. Most of my training was in physics and chemistry, but I'm in a biology department now. You have to show that your experience show them that despite the fact your background is in this, that you're well trained enough to do work in this department. And if there's a teaching requirement, that you can teach courses. So you have a chemistry background, you're applying to an engineering department. You should look through, the course listings and say, I'm well trained to teach these topics, in your department. I applied to like a physics. I had interviews at a physics institute, and biology departments, and sort of behavioral psych departments. And I always try to sort of leverage my experience for those specific institutes, saying, well, I have experience in this, which will help me succeed in your particular school or department. Very few departments are so balkanized that they will not, consider a chemist or consider a physicist. Science is not as categorized as that.
to close the breakout session, I want to ask you guys one last question before we enter the main session. And that is, what were some of the questions that you got in your interviews that you weren't prepared for? Any unexpected questions that came up and then you had to suddenly sort of answer those questions?
Can't think of any.
No?
I practiced a lot with people. I think to prevent that from happening, you should really practice your talk with a group of people from outside your field. Because oftentimes the committee, they're not all going to be, like if you're a neuroscientist, if you're applying to a biology department, they're not all going to be neuroscientists, you know. So you should really practice it with scientists who are the PhDs, but are not in your field. And they will ask all of those questions that other faculty members on the committee might ask. And I think it's just really good to practice so you're not surprised.
Yeah, I think, so I did a lot of more like self prep. I didn't necessarily practice a lot with other people, but I had a core team of like my mentors that I would constantly be bouncing things off of. So in that sense, but one of the questions I was asked that I didn't necessarily think about, but I was able to answer it was who your competitors were. So in the Chalk Talk, they asked you essentially, so, and that's them trying to gauge how well you know the field, right? So they're asking who your competitors were. And for instance, if you're submitting like a paper, so who would you put as potential reviewers, right? And that one, you just need to like think a little bit. So you repeat the question, and in that repeating, you think about the answers, and then, yeah, but yeah, those are some of the questions.
Just to follow up with that, and with something you said previously, you should definitely be aware of controversies in your field, because oftentimes in research, you're kind of in this little tunnel where you're kind of with your code, everyone sort of supports you, but you should be aware of all those disagreements in the field, because people who sort of support those other arguments could be in the committee, and you should know how to address their concerns and disagreements they might have with your work. Because people can be okay with hiring someone they might disagree with if the disagreement is not passionate, and if they think that you have an intelligent response to address those issues.
A student says, welcome to the BME department. Matthew says, welcome. We're about to move into the main session, and we'll complete some of the questions there. Some of it is very general questions. So feel free to go back to the main session right now. Join us in the main session, don't leave. And Jude, I'll see you, and Andrew, I'll see you there. Return to the main session. Hi, welcome back. How are your individual sessions? I know we don't have time to get to all the questions, but these are faculty members at Hopkins. You can reach out, I hope, at any time to ask some follow-up questions. But we had a question that I wanted to pose to all of you in our individual session. And that was from Grace, who was asking, being in academia is a high intensity sort of environment. How do primary caregivers and women who are pregnant, how do they lead with that in their interviews as well? How do they showcase that aspect? So can you touch upon a little bit about that if you have any idea?
Well, I will say I'm not a parent, but as the woman on the panel here, it's a really difficult situation. And I have watched actually very close colleagues go through, actually people who already have positions, go through navigating the kind of difficulty of even just telling people in their department that they're pregnant, right? At a place like Johns Hopkins, the idea that you might be taking a minute to start a family on the tenure track here is a very nerve-wracking decision for people to have made. And so I know women, other junior faculty who I've been in contact with here, have had to think really hard about that. I would say that it is important that you present yourself first as the kind of scholar or teacher that you think the place is looking for. And so in general, I think disclosure about your personal life should happen as late in the process as possible. And that goes not just for kind of childcare and caregiving responsibilities, but particularly things like partners, you know, living in a city, taking care of your parents, like those kinds of questions about how your life will need to be arranged to be successful in the job are things that are conversations that are mostly for after you get the offer. You don't want to, and unfortunately, you know, in the situation we are in, you know, jeopardizing your chances by making it seem as though something would be more difficult for you than another candidate, right? That is the kind of really crappy situation we remain in. And so I have found in general that people tend to try to disclose those things as late in the process as possible.
Yeah, that's
I agree. I agree with that. But I think it's important to have like a balance, right? So I'm like just starting as an assistant professor, but so I have a 1-year-old daughter, right? And late last year, I took 2 months off to like take care of her, right? And that was something that I had to think a lot about, right? And that's the kind of, not everybody won't do that, right? And you just have to know what's the right balance for you, right? And of course, my research took a hit. I wasn't able to like accomplish many things in 2 months, but prioritizing is important, right? If, you know, you have to know when family takes priority, job takes all priority, and like so forth. So it is all a personal balance. Yeah.
I would just follow up to say that one thing that I tell my graduate students all the time is you have to think about what kind of life you want to lead, right? Like there's the idea that the kind of everybody wants to be a professor on the tenure track at an R1 university, and everybody shouldn't want to do that, right? There are lots of different ways to be an academic. There are lots of different ways to be successful being an academic, and the kind of particular pressures of, for instance, the tenure track at a place like Johns Hopkins are, you know, have particular implications for how you live your life, right? And so thinking about what is it that you want from how you arrange your life? Would you rather be in a place that's like a little slower, that has different kinds of requirements? Do you need to be in one particular geographic area? Like sort of what are your priorities for what would make you happy as a human being, as a member of your family? Like those are things that you need to think about first. And the question of sort of rankings and, you know, all of the kinds of questions about the competitive things about academia, you have to sort of put those down a little bit behind exactly what Jude said, thinking about your priorities of how you want your life to actually be arranged.
Absolutely. And we have the last 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, I want to ask you guys, what questions do you suggest an interviewee, like a student, should ask their interviewers at the end of the day? So we'll start with you, Andrew. You've been on search faculty, so what questions do you recommend we ask?
Oh, you're muted. Oh, there we go.
There we go. I think a really good question to ask junior faculty in departments is to ask them what their experience has been like, and ask them what aspects of the department they don't like, to get a feel for how supportive their experience has been, and they get a feel for like what are the negatives of the department. Like, you know, I think I'm in a great department. If someone was asking a question, I would be honest with them about, you know, some things I think are shortcomings, but I do feel very supported. If you ask assistant professors and they talk about struggling to find support in the department, that's a red flag that this might not be the best place for you. I think always, in general, asking what people think are shortcomings or negatives about the place they're in is a good way to get some honesty out of them.
So one of the questions I always asked about was mentoring, right? So how, and it builds off of Andrew's comment about this, having a support, right? And one thing we have to constantly remember going through the interview process, and this didn't hit me until like later, after like I was reflecting on essentially like the whole process, was that you're also interviewing them, right? Because they're evaluating a fit, right? How well do I fit within your department, and like their perception of how you fit, right? So you want to make sure all the questions and the concerns that you have, you're able to get the answers to it, right? Because you know what, in the end, what happens is that you potentially have a couple offers, right? A bunch of offers on the table. And now you have to try to figure out, okay, like, why should I pick this one place over somewhere else? And a lot of time it goes back to like the people you met, like how well they interacted with you, a mentorship or network philosophy or structure that you can see yourself excelling in. Because it's not always about how big your startup package is or how big your salary is, right? Because a lot of times you don't pick the one that gives you the most money or the one that, you know, it's a lot of different parts of it. If sporting, going to like, see baseball games, football games is something important, ask the professors if, do you guys go out to see baseball games? What are some things that you do together as a faculty? Do you guys hang out? Do you have, like how well do you see that the faculty is like mixed, like know about each other? And that's based on your own preference, right? If you want to be like, sort of like in it as, part of the faculty club kind of thing, then that may work for you. But if not, and it all has to be that balance of what you want. So always remember, they're evaluating fit. And I never understood that until after. The fit is not just, if they want you or not. Yeah.
I will clarify that those are questions for the second interview after you have the offer. It's a bit presumptive to ask these questions when you're trying to get the offer in the first place.
Yeah,
but afterward, it's, yeah.
You have to have tact with how you ask the question, right?
Exactly,
You can't just go out and ask to be presumptive. Exactly.
Right.
But still, you still want to ask the question. Because, for instance, I didn't have any second interviews, right? So the structure of my search is where if you make it past the remote interview, you get to the on-site, and then that becomes offer or no offer, right? So and with the COVID, definitely no second interviews, right? So, so you just have to have a tact in how you do it.
Yeah, and I would say that, one kind of, one way to figure out, you definitely talking to people in kind of one-on-one, even if it's not a kind of post-offer situation, talking to junior faculty one-on-one, you will have those opportunities to say like, okay, do you feel supported here? What are your concerns? Those kinds of questions that you don't bring that up in a kind of group situation and be like, well, what are the problems with this place? But, being able to have those conversations one-on-one, I think is something that you can absolutely do. I would say in the group setting, like in the preliminary interview, when they say, do you have any questions for us? One interesting one that helps to illuminate some of these processes is to say, how does this hire, this line that you've decided to put in, fit into the broader strategy of the department? Like, is the department growing? Are you adding more lines? Is this a replacement? Is this an area that you want, you need more focus in? So asking a question that's like, how do you see this hire fitting into the departmental strategy over the next few years? That allows them to talk about, the particular area that they're searching for, if they are going to bring in more faculty who do that thing, if you are going to be the only faculty who does the thing that you do, right? And it also shows that you're interested in sort of the broader department. So it's a way for them to kind of talk about how they see your position fitting into their broader goals for the department. And so that's a useful one to try to end with.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jude, welcome to Hopkins. Welcome back, rather.
Yeah,
thank you for your time, your wisdom, for your honesty. I mean, this has been a fantastic session. I've learned a lot. I think we got to everyone's question, at least in the subgroups. We got into everyone's question. We just have one suggestion or recommendation from a student saying, if you do have any books, websites that help you prepare for faculty search interview process, I'll be happy to get that from you and distribute to the students as well, those that attended. So we'll cover that later. So thank you, everybody. We're ending exactly in an hour, which is what I wanted. So thanks again for your time. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed the session. I'll be in touch with the YouTube video and a feedback form. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Hey, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Christy.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Ashley.
Roshni, for organizing this.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley. See you in 10 minutes. We have another meeting.